This is, I think, the fourth or fifth time I've had the immense pleasure and honor of introducing Colum McCann to read from his fiction. You'll know, of course, that he is the winner of many prestigious prizes, the Irish Times Fiction Prize, the National Book Award, and many others. But what I think makes Colum such an important person to come into the conversation that we've started with Mick and Lenny's work today is that Colum is he's fundamentally an Irish writer. He's a carrier of the tradition of Irish letters of the highest order. But he's also an Irish-American writer in the sense that he's made his home here, he's made his community here, he's made his career here. But he's also an American writer. Colum's Let the Great World Spin is, I think, by any measure, the great work of contemporary American fiction in the post-9/11 era, and a work of incredible sort of daring and imagination, followed by his incredible work of literally cultural theory of culture centered in the work of Transatlantic, which touches on many of the issues that Mick and Lenny prepared us for and then set before us. But when I mentioned that I wanted to do something on this topic and that I thought it was important for all the reasons that I outlined when I began today, Colum said, please, I'd love to be included, I'd love to come. We had to postpone this once. Colum McCann can read anytime he wants, anywhere, and be very well paid for it, but he said he wanted to come and be part of this conversation. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Colum McCann.
I'm reminded after watching Mick and Lenny, a friend of mine, Jim Harrison, who's a poet, he says in one of his poems, after the passing of irresistible music, one has to get used to the dripping of the faucet. So I'm the dripping of the faucet after that, because that was really incredible. I think they deserve another round of applause. I'm going to read from two books today. One is Transatlantic. I'm going to start off with Transatlantic, a piece about Frederick Douglass in Ireland. And then I'm going to read from a novel I wrote, I couldn't believe it when I look back, it was over 20 years ago, called This Side of Brightness, where I lived with the homeless people in the subway tunnels, but I also talked about the history of the building of the subway tunnels, which was done primarily by Irish American and African Americans together. And I have some pieces that hopefully speak to exactly what Mick and Lenny were talking about. And if we have time, maybe we'll, I don't know if we'll have time for questions, but we'll see. And then we have the music then afterwards, which is that's when the irresistible music comes back again in the tower. Okay, so this is just the words of Frederick Douglass to begin with. It must be said, should I go on a mic?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead. It must be said that in my time here in Ireland, my heart feels stirred. Instead of the bright blue sky of America, I am covered with the soft grey fog of the Emerald Isle. I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man. And though I have seen much that would make my own people tremble, I am encouraged to exercise my true and proper voice. I breathe the sea air freely, and while there is much I observe to make the heart heavy, I am at least temporarily without chains. Those are the words of Frederick Douglass in 1845 and 1846, when he's still a slave, and he went to tour on a lecture tour around Ireland. I was completely corralled by this notion, and I thought at first it was absolutely wonderful. You know, this black slave goes to Ireland, and the further I dug, the more complicated and contradictory it became for me. It's like that Whitman-esque notion, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. And this little section, I just want to talk to you. Frederick Douglass has been out on the road. He's been met by a famine spectre of a woman who's offered him her dead baby. And now he's back down in Cork, and he's trying to come to terms with Irish politics. And his own politics then, of course, too. He walked along the River Lee, his hands clasped behind his back, a new walk for him, large and public, the attitude of a thinking man. He enjoyed the pose, found it conducive to the idea of himself. He heard the clopping of a horse behind him on the cobbles, the soft sound of a harness creaking. Isabel descended the horse. Isabel is a woman from Cork. She's from a Quaker family. Isabel descended the horse, walked alongside him, her hand careful at the horse's neck, the sheen of sweat on the animal's body. Barges plied along the river. Corn barges, barley barges, cattle barges, salt barges, pig barges, sheep for the slaughterhouse further downriver. Firkins of butter, oatmeal, flour bags, egg boxes, baskets of turkey, canned fruit, bottled soda and minerals. They watched the river of food in silence. Gulls busied themselves behind the boats, swooping every now and then to claim what they could. They walked along by a merchant marine shop, a bookseller's, a tailor shop. Further down the quays, she pulled a horse close to her, as if it might offer protection. I could not find her. Excuse me? That woman you met upon the road, she says. For a brief moment, he was not sure what Isabel was talking about, an incidental skim of words across the surface of the day. But then he caught himself. He said it was a great shame, but he was sure the child was buried by now. You did what you could, said Isabel. He knew it was not so. He had done nothing at all. He had borne witness and stayed silent. There's nothing worse, she said, than a small coffin. He juggled the words in his mind a moment. He nodded. He liked her. He thought of her increasingly these past few days as a younger sister. It was odd to think so, her green eyes, her awkward walk, the rustle of her humble dresses. But that's what she was, sisterly, hovering, curious, intrusive. She explored new ideas with him. There were few limits. What did he think of the notion of Liberia? What was the gulf between revenge and justice? Did he have a plan with Garrison to send the money back from churches that embraced slaveholders? She was quieter when the talk returned to what was happening around them. She stopped mid-sentence. She worried the bracelet on her left arm. She gazed into the distance and her voice caught. There was enough food in Ireland. There was enough food in the land to feed Ireland 3 or 4 times over, she said. It was being shipped across to India, China, the West Indies. The exhaustion of empire. She wished there was something she could do about it. The truth could not be preserved by silence. Her own family had warehouses full of food further down the river. Bottles of vinegar, stocks of yeast, malting barley, even crates of fruit jam, but it could not just be given away. There were laws, and there were customs, and there were issues of ownership. Other complexities too, business alliances, extended contracts, taxation, the demands of the poor, the creation of moral illusions. It struck him that Isabel carried the wounds of privilege. Perhaps then he did also. He leafed through the New Testament. From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And yet, if he himself spoke out on behalf of the poor Irish, what would happen? What language could he, Douglas, create for this? To whom would he speak? The politics still confounded him. Who was Irish? Who was British? Who was Catholic? Who was Protestant? Who owned the land? Whose child stood rheumy-eyed with hunger? Whose house was burned to the ground? Whose soil belonged to whom and why? The simple way to see it was that the British were Protestant, the Irish were Catholic. One ruled, the other lay underfoot. But where did Webb, his publisher, fit in? And where did Isabel fit in? He would gladly have allowed himself to align with the desires of freedom and justice, but it was to his own known cause that he had to remain entirely loyal. 3 million slaves. He could not speak out against those who had brought him here as a visitor. There was only so much he could take upon himself. He had to look to what mattered. What was beyond toleration was the ownership of man and woman. The Irish were poor, but not enslaved. He had come here to hack away at the ropes that held American slavery in place. Sometimes it withered him just to keep his mind steady. He was aware that the essence of proper intelligence was the embrace of contradiction, and the recognition of complexity was to be balanced against the need for simplicity. He was still a slave, fugitive. If he returned to Boston, he could be kidnapped at any time, taken south, strapped to a tree, whipped. His owners. They would make a spectacle of his fame.
They had tried to silence him for many years already. No longer. He had been given a chance to speak out against what had held him in chains, and he would continue to do so until the links lay in pieces at his feet. And he thought he knew now what had brought him here to Ireland. The chance to explore what it felt to be free and captive at the same time. It was not something even the most aggrieved Irishman could ever understand, to be in bondage to everything, even the idea of one's own peace. His body, his mind, his soul had for years served only for the profit of others. He had his own people to whom he was pledged. 3 million slaves. They were the currency of his freedom. What weight would he carry if he tried to support the Irish too? Their agonies, their ambiguities. He had enough of his own. The barges passed, a river of food afloat, and the sun went down over the slate rooftops of Cork. Okay, 3 little pieces from this side of Brightness, and then a couple of questions. Okay, they're in the tunnels. Lenny and Mick were talking about the Irish working together, working alongside each other and against one another. The Sandhogs were the first integrated union in the United States. So the Irish and the blacks, they worked quite closely together. The metaphor of all of this, of course, is fantastic in that they were going underground in order to do so. They were going into the darkness. There were horses that would be lowered down into the tunnels, and the horses that would never even come out again. Sometimes these men felt this way, that they would never come out of these tunnels. Always at the head of the tunnel, they put the Irish and the blacks together. They were the ones most likely to die at the head of the tunnel. And this is just a little piece about one of the African American characters, Nathan Walker, before there's a spectacular accident underground. In the manlock, the doors close tight and the air hisses in around them. Walker opens the top button of his overcoat. He can feel his toes loosening now in the hot, pressurized air. A bead of sweat forms on his brow, and he flicks it away with his thumb. Beside him, OLeary stands slumped against the wall, breathing deeply. The two are soon joined by Sean Power and Rhubarb Vanucci. The air grows torrid as the pressure rises. It is as if a heat wave has decided to accompany them underground during winter. The 4 men hold their noses until their ears begin to pop. After a few minutes, Power crouches down and takes a deck of cards from his dungarees. The men search in their pockets for coins, and they play hog poker while the air compresses their bodies to 32 pounds per square inch. Walker wins the first round, and Power slaps the young black man on the shoulder. "Look at you, hey, the king of spades." But Walker takes no offense. He knows there is a democracy beneath this river. In the darkness, every man's blood runs the same color. A Dago, the same as a nigger, the same as a Polak, the same as a Mick. So he just laughs, and he puts the winnings in his pocket, and he deals the second hand. All the taunts scribbled down in a school copybook: half-breed, mulatto, sambo, honky, snowboy, zebra, cracker, jungle bunny, coon, wonderbread, Uncle Tom, crazy horse, spade. And this little section here, and I might do one more section from Transatlantic, is an Irish woman, Eleanor OLeary, and she has met Nathan Walker, and she has married him, the black tunnel digger, and they have a child. The child's name is Clarence. They live in Harlem, and she works in a factory. And this is a section that I think hopefully captures much of what this tension of being Irish, this tension of being white, this tension of having a relationship with a person from a supposedly different background. So this is just from her point of view. So Actually, she stands in the doorway and leans her head against the frame. Halfway across the room, Walker sees that she is weeping. And then he realizes that his wife doesn't want to cross the threshold as if something has pinned her there. I was sitting in the warehouse, Nathan. I was sewing the hem on a pair of trousers. We all sit in a big long line. The Singer machine's in front of us. I don't know what happened to me. But it's terrible. It's so terrible. He was coming from school. He had his report card. He got himself an A in science. I guess he wanted to tell me that. I guess he just wanted to tell his mama that he was doing good in school. And the other women, Nathan, they don't know a thing about me. They don't know nothing about me. They don't know nothing about you. All they know is that I live uptown. They don't even know where uptown. They don't know nothing about you nor the kids. It's just that, well, it's just, I don't know what it is, Nathan. I'm not ashamed. It ain't that. I suppose I just didn't want them to know about me, just to keep us all safe, do you know? Take it easy, El. You remember I told you that the boss's name is O'Leary? Well, I told him when I first got the job, I told him my maiden name is O'Leary too. And I didn't say nothing about being a Walker. And seeing as how I'm an O'Leary, he's nice to me. He doesn't shout at me if I spend too long a coffee break and all, seeing how I'm Irish. He likes me, not in that way, but he likes me. And anyway, I'm sewing the hem on those trousers when I look, and there's our son Clarence at the door of the warehouse. He's pointing at me. You know what I do? I put my head down. Nathan, I don't know why I was trembling. I pretended I was concentrating on the hem, being very careful with it. I could hear the footsteps. They're the loudest footsteps I ever heard, and when I looked up again, they were both standing in front of me. And O'Leary, he says to me, "This here boy says that he wants to see his mama." I don't know what happened to me, Nathan. All of a sudden, I let go of the trousers and the hem zigzagged across. You wouldn't believe how quiet that place was. Everyone was looking at me, all the other seamstresses, silent as could be. I just said, "Pardon me?" And the boss, he says, "This here boy says that he wants to see his mother." Real insistent, the boss, he's real insistent. And I just let out a nervous giggle. I'm just sitting there with this nervous giggle, Nathan, and I said, "Oh, that's just a term of speech. I know his mama very well." "Oh, El, you didn't. You couldn't have." "Oh, Eleanor." And O'Leary, he's staring at me, and his eyes are all wide. And Clarence, he's staring at me too. And Clarence has got his report card in his hand. And I look up at the boss, and I said it again. "It's just a term of speech. You know how people talk." And Clarence, he's got this look on his face like the whole world has just tumbled in on him, like something went in and collapsed his face right down like a tunnel. And he says to me, "Mama." I think I'm going to hear that word forever, the way he said it. Mama. Like it's just the most important thing he ever said, Mama. But I just looked around the warehouse and everybody was staring at me. "His mama is a friend of mine. His mama lives local to me." That's what I said. And O'Leary, he takes our son by the scruff of the neck. "What are you wasting this lady's time for?" he says. And Clarence says, "I just wanted to tell her that I got an A in science." And O'Leary, he swells up real big and he laughs and he looks around the warehouse. "An A in science," he shouts. "It must have been in evolution." Son of a bitch. And Clarence, he was there and he was crying. He's got these tears coming down his face and he says to me again, "Mama." And I didn't say a word to him. I just didn't say a word. I didn't even say "well done." Well done for the A in science. I was dumbstruck and I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to be that way. It just happened to me, Nathan. I swear I didn't mean it. Oh, God in heaven, believe me that I never meant to ignore him like that. I never will. I just sat there and watched O'Leary drag Clarence out of the warehouse, and I've never felt a sorrier thing in my life. I turned and looked at the other seamstresses, and oh God, Nathan, I just got up and I pushed my way past O'Leary and I grabbed my coat and I ran out and went to look for our son, but he was nowhere around. I looked and looked and looked, but he was gone. And tiny last little piece, just from the last section. This is half a page, again from Frederick Douglass. There was a story he sometimes told his audiences. The slave masters in America used barrels, bourbon mostly, olive oil, wine, any sort of barrel that could be found. They drove large 6-inch nails into the wood. Sometimes they placed crushed glass inside the barrel too, or thorny bushes. Then, they said, they would bring their slave. He always invoked this word on a deeper pitch, did Douglass, to the top of the hill. For the most minor of offences, maybe she had forgotten to lock the stable door. Or perhaps she had dropped a piece of crockery. Or maybe she had looked askance at the mistress of the house. Or maybe she had left a dishcloth dirty. It did not matter. She was to be punished. It was the natural order of things. But halfway through his story, he would give the slave a name. Mary. He would hear a silence then come over his Irish listeners. Mary, he said again. And then the owners, and this word volleyed savagely from him, forced Mary to take the barrel from the barn. It was rolled out into the dust along the dirt road to the top of a small nearby hill. They gathered the other slaves together and brought them to the hilltop to witness. The owners would often shout verses from the holy book. They forced Mary to step inside the wooden barrel. They pushed Mary's head down, crushed her shoulders into it. The protruding nails ripped Mary's body. The glass penetrated her feet. The thorns encircled her shoulders, and then the masters put the lid on, and they hammered it shut. They rocked it back and forth a few minutes, and they read again from the holy book. And then the barrel went down the hill with Mary tumbling. Okay, that's it.
Can we ask a question?
Yes, we'll have a few minutes for questions with Colum, and then I promise you we're going to take a few minutes break while the band sets up. Have a brief chat with the tower before we get going again. So please,
Colin,
Yeah.
could you speak about the O'Connell's repeal and how American Irish workers, particularly above the Mason-Dixon line, responded to it?
Well, you'd probably know as much, if not more, about that. I mean, O'Connell and Douglas, they really only met probably once, maybe twice, but they were incredibly important to one another. And what O'Connell had written and how Douglas revered him was spectacular, and the way that relationship developed between the two. Unfortunately, O'Connell was older. He was just out of jail. He was getting sick, and he was to die. I think if that relationship had had more time, so many things could have been better. I don't know all that much about what happened with the workers on north of the Mason-Dixon line, but maybe you can tell us.
Well,
Seriously.
the reaction was completely the opposite. It actually caused greater antagonism.
Oh,
because
I know what you're talking about.
of the, and I just lost the term, the interruption of America's isolationism
Right.
by the lady.
I think, and what's really interesting about the time, because it's the famine, is this whole Emersonian notion of self-reliance. You got to look after yourself, and that's somewhat why the famine actually even occurred. But Douglas would have been I mean, when I was writing about Douglas, I liked him at first. I thought this great romantic notion about this fantastic statesman going to Ireland, and then the more I got into it, I really began to dislike him. I said, why didn't you speak out? Why didn't you say something about all these people starving in the streets? And then I realized he was protecting his own people. And then I fell back in love with him again. And I have enormous respect. But the tug on his conscience and the tug on his heart and soul at that particular time seems to me that, and this is what, when you guys were talking, I thought it was really interesting, because the tension between being black and white is really quite fantastic, but it also brings us together. Brodsky talks about, how do we recognize what is dark? Well, we have to know what is light. How do we know what is light? We have to recognize what is dark. And there's a spectacular tension. I don't know what this thing between African Americans and Irish Americans is, but I'll tell you that when I went down, say, to the tunnels of New York to research this book with the homeless people, American reporters could not get down. American photographers could not get down the tunnels under Riverside and Grand Central. And I got down because I had an Irish accent. And these guys would come up to me, and they'd be like, and mostly African American young men, they'd say, "Hey man, I'm Irish too," you know. Names like McAuliffe and all this stuff, and they would look after me. And whether they're right or wrong, there was an identification with the history of oppression. You went, the same happened to your people as happened to me. And that was incredible. And I love the fact that you can go up to Belfast and you can see the murals on the wall. You can see Stokely Carmichael, Miriam Makeba, Frederick Douglass, like all of these people on the walls, and our identification. And how our civil rights movement grew out of the American civil rights movement, that we would be singing "We Shall Overcome" on the streets of Derry in the late 60s. I mean, that's very important to understand. So this great tension and great admiration go together. It's almost like, well, it's like a marriage, come to think of it.
Well, Colum, did you have this history, this hidden history that we've been talking about in terms of intermarriage? Did you have an idea of that, or was it just the sympathetic imagination that made the Walker OLeary marriage central to the book? Because it's not, you've been in the States for a while, but
Right.
you haven't been here that long when you wrote that.
No, I hadn't been here that long. I mean, some of the, I mean, to be too acutely conscious of what you want to do is very dangerous. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and sometimes when I write a book, the story just like appears for me. Like, for example, her denying her son came out of the blue. And she made her a much more complex character for me. But I did want to talk then about miscegenation. I did want to talk about the way we come together. And for me to think that book is 20 years old, it was odd. I haven't read from it in years and years and years, so it was funny to read from it today. I think we have one more question, or yeah? I know you guys are okay.
I want to push the history back. This is partially what Mick was referring to even earlier. There was a guy named Alejandro O'Reilly who was born in Dublin in 1722, and at the age of 10, becomes a very young wild geese and joins the Spanish Army. He winds up going to Cuba at the time of the British surrender when they left Cuba. Then he goes to New Orleans and becomes the governor of New Orleans. And when he's the governor, he brings the Spanish laws on slavery into New Orleans, which allowed much clearer path for people to become freedmen. We're talking now the 1760s, or 1770s, people to become freedmen, or for owners to free their slaves. This is pushing even before Lenny's references to New Orleans, but there's a street in Havana named for O'Reilly, and there's a statue of O'Reilly in New Orleans.
All right.
And as Mick said, we're going back in November, and if people want to come, they should see me during the break.
All right, great. That's just talking about statues in New Orleans. I heard a very funny thing about the statue of Robert E. Lee is in New Orleans, I think, right near the YMCA. And what the locals say the YMCA stands for is Yankees Might Come Again. But I don't know. I have to say, just on this one last thing, that I think this is very important. I think this should be an ongoing dialogue. And things happen in academia, and then they will filter down over the years. And there are some very, very, very important things being done and being said here. And I think a lot of credit has to go to John Waters for putting all this together. Thank you very much.